Fog does not fall in London so much as it arrives, patiently, confidently, like a visitor who knows the doors will open without being asked. On that particular evening, it pressed itself into the seams of the streets and the collars of hurried men. It softened the clatter of hooves. It swallowed the far edges of gaslight until each flame seemed alone, trembling in its own small halo. And somewhere behind those halos, in a lane too narrow for pride and too quiet for comfort, a man stopped being alive. The constable who found him would later insist the city had gone strangely silent at the moment he turned the corner. He had been walking his beat with the usual irritation of cold damp climbing into his joints, counting steps, listening for trouble in the shapeless murmur of the night. But when he reached that lane, the sound seemed to step back as if it had been ordered to. The body lay near the wall, not sprawled with drunken carelessness, but folded at an angle that suggested sudden weakness, an attempt to brace, and the failure of it. The man's coat was wet with fog as though he had been standing there some time, yet the damp looked too even, too untroubled, as if no one had knelt beside him. A thin line of grime marked one sleeve where it had brushed the bricks on the way down. There was no theatrical blood, no obvious wound that could satisfy the appetite of a crowd. Only a face turned partly toward the street, eyes half open as if still trying to understand something that had happened too quickly. In his pocket was a silver watch. Its lid was closed, but the hinge had sprung, and it sat slightly ajar, like a mouth that had started to form a word and stopped. When the constable pried it open, the hands were frozen at a precise minute, uncannily neat, as though time itself had been instructed to halt. At the far end of the lane stood a street lantern, one of the tall cast-iron posts the city had grown to trust. But that lantern, so the constable swore, had been dark when he arrived. Dark in a way that did not feel like simple failure, but like absence. In fog, a dead lantern makes a particular kind of blackness, a blackness that looks thicker than night. Lestrade arrived with breath still visible in the air, cap pulled low, shoulders set with the weary confidence of a man who has seen too many bodies and too many lies. He took in the scene, barked orders, asked the right questions in the right tones. He did what the police always did first. He sought the shape of a story that would close. "Robbery," he said at last, glancing at the man's pockets, the street, the damp stones. The lane, the fog, the light goes out, someone steps in, takes what he wants, leaves him like this. It's plain enough. It would have been plain enough if the city had not provided a witness who made it complicated. By morning the news had travelled, as news always does, faster than truth and with less regard for consequence. The dead man had a name, Henry Talbot, clerk to a small legal office near Holborn. Not a rich man, not a notorious one. A man who might have walked home late with papers in his coat and thoughts of nothing more murderous than the rent. Yet before noon, while Baker Street still held the stale warmth of yesterday's coal, and the air in 221B carried faint traces of tobacco and chemical experiments, Mrs. Hudson came upstairs with her face pinched tight. "There is a gentleman below, Mr. Holmes," she said, voice lowered. "He's in a state." Holmes looked up from his chair with the particular stillness that meant attention had been turned like a lens. Watson, standing near the window, watched the way Holmes's fingers paused, mid-motion, as though the air itself had become interesting. "A state can be useful," Holmes murmured. "Send him up." The man who entered did not look like a criminal. That was perhaps the first danger of him. He was clean-shaven, moderately dressed, coat brushed, boots polished though not new. He carried a hat in both hands and kept turning it, as if the pressure of his palms could make the room safer. His eyes were wide, but not with righteous outrage. They had the watchfulness of a man expecting to be struck. "My name is Elijah Pierce," he began quickly, words tumbling to outrun his fear. I came because the police, Inspector Lestrade, he said I should make a statement, and I did, but then I thought perhaps I ought to speak to you, Mr. Holmes. They said you see things." Holmes did not offer the easy comfort men often gave to trembling strangers. His comfort, when it came, arrived in the form of order. "Sit, Mr. Pierce," he said. You have made a statement. Repeat it for us, slowly. Pierce sat, perching on the edge as if the chair were uncertain ground. He swallowed and began again, voice thin. He had been walking along the main street when he saw a figure turn into the lane. Another figure followed. There was an argument, a sudden scuffle. Then the lantern went out, he emphasized, as if that extinguishing were the hinge upon which the whole night swung. In the momentary blackness he heard a sound like a blow. When the lantern flared again, he saw the second man run with a particular limp, and he saw the face clearly enough to swear to it. Holmes listened without moving, eyes half-lidded, as if the words were less important than the manner in which they were arranged. Watson watched Pierce's hands on the hat brim. The fingers worried the felt until the edge began to fray. "And the face," Holmes said at last. "Describe it." Pierce blinked rapidly. It was sharp, the cheekbones, and the eyes dark, angry, a hard mouth. "Hair." "Fair," Pierce said, then immediately corrected himself. "No, dark. It was dark, under a cap." "A cap," Holmes repeated. "Yes." Watson watched Pierce's gaze flick to the mantel, to the poker, to the corner where the umbrella stand waited like a row of silent staff. "And you are certain," Holmes said, "that you saw this face in the instant the lantern flared again, after having gone out completely?" "Yes," Pierce insisted. "I swear it, I could not mistake it." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Which hand held the lantern?" he asked. It was an innocent question on its surface, almost absurdly so. Yet Pierce's reaction was immediate and violent. His shoulders jerked. The hat slipped in his hands. I don't know," he stammered. "The hand, why does that matter? It was he held it. You said the lantern went out," Holmes said, voice calm, still unraised. "Then it flared. Are you telling me the killer held a lantern as he ran down a lane already serviced by a streetlight?" Pierce's throat bobbed. His eyes shone with something that was not simply fear of being disbelieved. It was the fear of having said too much and too little at the same time. "I told them what I saw," he whispered. Holmes let the silence lengthen, and in that stretch of quiet, Watson noticed something else. It came to him like a memory of a certain scent in a hospital ward, the sharp, greasy tang that clung to cloth and skin. Lamp oil. Not the faint smell of a lamp in a distant room, not the mild smoke of a household candle. This was close, persistent, as if Pierce had carried a lantern himself, or had been near one long enough to absorb it into his coat. Watson's eyes met Holmes's, and though neither spoke, an understanding moved between them. The witness had brought more than words into the room. He had brought the residue of the night. Holmes rose, crossing to the window. Outside, Baker Street carried on in its own practical way, carriages passing, people gliding through fog as if it belonged to them. Holmes did not look at any of it. He looked at the reflection in the glass, the room behind him, Pierce's hunched figure, the trembling hat. "Mr. Pierce," Holmes said, almost gently now, "you are frightened. Not of the killer you claim to have seen, but of someone who has instructed you what to claim. Am I wrong?" Pierce's lips parted. He seemed on the edge of speech, then retreated. I only want it done," he said hoarsely. "I only want to go home and be left alone." "Home," Watson repeated quietly, testing the word as if it might break. Pierce flinched at the sound of Watson's voice, as though two men speaking to him at once were too much. Holmes turned back, his gaze sharpening. "Did the police take your lantern, Mr. Pierce?" he asked. Pierce frowned, confused, then nodded quickly, grateful for a question he could answer. "Yes, I brought it in. I thought they told me I should. It's just a small thing. I use it when I return late." "And who took it?" Holmes asked. "A man," Pierce said, from the gas company. He said it was procedure that if a lantern had been used near the scene, if the light had behaved strangely, they needed to inspect it. He had papers. Holmes's expression did not change, but Watson felt the temperature in the room shift, as if the coal fire had swallowed its own heat. "What was the man's name?" Holmes asked. Pierce shook his head desperately. "I don't know." He spoke quickly. "He wore a badge brass. He was polite." Polite, Watson thought, and cold things were often polite. Holmes moved closer again, and for the first time Pierce truly looked at him, as if realizing that this man's attention was something that could not be shaken off once granted. "Tell me," Holmes said, "when you stood in that lane when the street lantern went dark, where were you standing?" Pierce swallowed, his eyes darted. "Near the mouth of it," he said, "on the main street." "And yet you smelled the oil," Watson thought, and did not say it aloud. Holmes nodded once, the smallest gesture. "You will do one thing for me, Mr. Pierce," he said. "You will not return home alone today. You will go with Dr. Watson for tea. You will remain in public. You will not accept a single invitation, polite or otherwise, from any man with papers and a badge. Do you understand?" Pierce hesitated, then nodded, relief and dread mingling in equal measure. Holmes's voice softened in a way that felt almost like a courtesy. "And if you want more stories where the truth is earned, not guessed, where one small detail can pull an entire lie apart, you can subscribe. Because what happens next in this case will not be decided by fists in the fog, but by who controls the light." Pierce blinked at the strange phrasing, not understanding it as an aside to unseen listeners, only sensing that Holmes had just made the room larger than its walls. When Pierce had been guided out, Watson lingering behind him like a steady shadow, Holmes remained still for a long moment. He looked at the empty chair, the frayed edge of hat felt left behind like evidence, the faint smear on the armrest where oil-dark fingers had rested. Then he reached for his coat with sudden decision. "Holmes," Watson began, pausing at the door. Holmes's eyes were bright now, not with excitement, but with that disciplined intensity that always preceded danger. "A street lantern does not choose to lie," he said. "A witness does, and if the gas company has already collected the one object that could prove which, then someone has begun to tidy the truth." He turned toward the stairs, already moving. "Come, Watson, we are going to see who profits when London goes blind." And as they stepped into the fog, the question hung between them like a living thing. If the lantern could be commanded to die on cue, what else in this city could be switched off? Witnesses, records, even lives, by a hand that never showed its face. The question still clung to them as they stepped out into the fog. If a lantern could be commanded to die on cue, then someone in London had learned how to switch off more than light. Baker Street in the grey of late morning looked almost innocent. The street lamps stood like polite sentinels, their glass bellies dull in daylight, their iron collars beaded with moisture. Carriages moved with muffled patience. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds as if sweeping might keep the city's anxieties from settling. Yet the fog remained, even in daylight, an uninvited presence that softened edges and encouraged rumor. Holmes walked with that peculiar economy of motion that always made Watson feel he was following a man who had already arrived. His eyes were everywhere and nowhere, on a splash of mud at a curb, on the angle of a poster lifting from a wall, on the soot beneath a lampost's base. He said nothing for several streets, and Watson knew better than to break the silence. When Holmes was quiet, it meant the city was speaking. They did not go first to the police. That would have been the expected route, the one that allowed other men's assumptions to define the borders of the inquiry. Holmes preferred to begin where the lie had been manufactured. The gasworks lay to the east, a sprawling complex of brick and iron where the air carried a permanent taste of coal. Even from a distance, the place had its own weather. A faint haze, a low churn of smoke, the breath of furnaces rising like sighs. Men moved in and out of doors with blackened collars and hands that never quite lost the memory of grime. The work was honest, in the sense that it was hard and it was necessary. And perhaps that was why it was so convenient as a hiding place for dishonesty. Few people wished to look too closely at what kept their lamps burning. At the gate, a watchman in a thick coat lifted a hand. "Works are not for wandering," he began, then stopped when Holmes offered a card and a mild smile that suggested compliance while promising inconvenience. "We are not wandering," Holmes said. "We are tracing a lantern." The watchman frowned, as if the word itself were absurd in such a place, where 1,000 lanterns were merely 1,000 objects to be filled, cleaned, repaired, and forgotten. "A lantern," he repeated. Holmes did not waste time with explanations meant to soothe. He asked for the foreman in charge of maintenance calls in the district, near the lane where Henry Talbot had died. Names mattered less than functions. Holmes always hunted the hinge rather than the door. They were led through a yard where carts of coal sat like small hills, and into a long room lined with shelves that held glass chimneys, mantles, valves, and brass fittings. The smell was sharper here, oil and metal and something faintly acidic that caught at the back of the throat. A man in a neat waistcoat stood at a desk, pen poised above a ledger that looked official by the simple virtue of being bound in dark leather. He rose as they approached, face composed into the practiced politeness of a man who dealt with complaints and inspections. "Gentlemen," he said, voice smooth. "Foreman Abel, how may I be of service?" Holmes introduced himself with no flourish, and Watson watched the tiny shift in Abel's eyes at the name. It was not fear, it was recognition, the awareness that the conversation might not remain on the surface. "We are concerned," Holmes said, "with a street lantern in a lane off the main road near Holborn. It failed last night at the precise minute a man died." Abel's expression did not change, but something in his posture tightened, as if the muscles beneath the politeness were bracing. "Lanterns fail," he said. "Fog and damp get into the fittings, pressure drops, mantles tear, it happens." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and when it happens it is logged. A call is recorded, a man is sent, the repair is entered, that is the order of the thing." Abel gestured toward the leather ledger on the desk. "All calls are recorded," he said. "We keep proper books." Holmes's gaze drifted over the room. On a shelf to the left sat a row of mantles, each packed in paper and labelled with district marks. He crossed to them as if drawn by casual interest. Watson recognized the maneuver, Holmes pretending to browse so that the other man might reveal what he feared. Holmes lifted one packet, examined it, replaced it. Then another. His fingers were clean, but they moved with the confidence of someone who could handle 1,000 objects without disturbing their secrets. "These are not all the same," Holmes said lightly. "No," Abel answered, still polite. "Different lanterns, different fittings. Some districts use a slightly different mantle." Holmes turned, packet in hand. "And which districts use that particular mantle?" he asked. Abel's eyes flicked toward the packet. The western stretches, near the parks, certain newer installations. Holmes nodded as though it were a trivial lesson. "How interesting," he said, "because I would have expected a man in Holborn to smell less like that mantle and more like coal smoke." Abel's mouth tightened for a moment, then smoothed again. "I'm not sure what you mean." Holmes placed the packet back on the shelf with exact care. "I mean," he said, "that the witness in this case, Mr. Elijah Pierce, smelled strongly of lamp oil, enough to suggest he has handled lanterns recently, perhaps in more than one district. And I mean that his lantern was collected this morning by a man claiming to be from your company. Abel's eyebrows rose just slightly, like a curtain being lifted a fraction. That would be procedure, he said. If a private lantern was used near a scene of failure, we might inspect. Holmes lifted a hand, gentle but final. Procedure is useful, he said. It gives men a reason to do what they already wish to do. Let us see the official record of any such collection. Abel hesitated, then opened the leather ledger and flipped pages with an air of willingness. The paper rustled in a steady rhythm, the sound oddly comforting in a room filled with the sharpness of oil. He pointed to columns of neat entries, addresses, dates, times, initials. There, he said, you see, calls, repairs, everything accounted for. Holmes leaned in. Watson did too, though he knew Holmes was not reading the ledger in the way most men did. Holmes did not look for information, he looked for the absence of it. What time do you log calls? Holmes asked. Upon receipt, Abel replied, or when the man returns, depends on the urgency. And who writes these entries? Holmes asked. My clerk, Abel said, and myself when needed. Holmes's finger traced down a column without touching it, like a shadow passing over a wall. And last night, Holmes said softly, at the minute the lantern in that lane went out, was there a call? Abel shook his head. None. If it failed, it must have relit itself. It happens. A draft, a momentary pressure. Holmes straightened. Then you will not mind, he said, if we see the unofficial ledger. For the first time, Abel's politeness faltered. It was only a blink too long, a fraction of breath held, but Holmes noticed everything that lived between words. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Abel said, voice still smooth but now edged with something harder. Holmes smiled, not warmly, but with the calm of a man who had already picked up the thread and felt how it ran. What I mean, he said, is that a system as large as yours does not run purely on official calls. There are always side arrangements, gentlemen who prefer not to appear in a ledger, maintenance that is requested without being recorded, and because such things are useful to men who wish to control light, they are often written down somewhere else, by a hand that thinks itself hidden. Abel's chin lifted slightly. You are accusing us. I am observing, Holmes corrected, still mild, and I have not yet accused. Accusation requires certainty. Observation requires only sight. Holmes stepped closer to the desk, and Watson saw now what Holmes had been waiting for. Abel's right hand, resting near the ledger, wore a glove, clean, well-fitted, the glove of a man who wished to appear respectable in a place of grime. But on the inside of the wrist, where the glove met the cuff, there was a mark, a small singe, brown-black, shaped not like random scorch but like the kiss of a specific object. Holmes's eyes rested there, as if he had found a word written in invisible ink. That burn, Holmes said. Abel looked down instinctively, then quickly back up. Too late, the reflex had betrayed him. It's nothing, he said. A man works with heat. A man works with heat, Holmes agreed, but a foreman in a neat waistcoat who keeps his gloves clean does not usually press his wrist against a mantle housing, unless he is handling lantern parts himself, unless he is making adjustments personally, and unless that mantle housing is of a type used in only certain districts. Watson watched the color drain from Abel's face in slow increments, as if the blood were retreating from an area exposed to cold. Holmes's voice remained calm, almost conversational. Last night, Holmes said, someone caused a street lantern to go dark at the precise minute a man died. This morning, someone collected a private lantern from a witness who smells of oil and fear. The official ledger shows nothing, so I ask again, where is the other book? Abel's throat worked. For a moment he seemed to consider defiance. Watson could see the calculation. How much power did Holmes truly have in this room? How far could a foreman's pride carry him before the machinery of law became real? Then Abel did something subtle and telling. He did not call for guards. He did not shout. He simply moved his chair back with careful deliberation and stepped toward a cabinet against the far wall. It was locked. He produced a key from his pocket with fingers that tried not to tremble. The key scraped in the lock, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. He opened the cabinet, reached inside, and drew out a book smaller than the official ledger. Its cover was plain, its edges worn, as if it had been handled often and quickly, taken in and out of hiding with practiced ease. He placed it on the desk, as though laying down a confession. Holmes did not touch it immediately. He waited, allowing the room to settle around the object. "This is not company practice," Abel said, voice strained but still attempting dignity. "It's my own record, for special calls." "Special," Holmes echoed, and Watson heard in his tone the quiet contempt that came when Holmes encountered a man who used gentle words to dress ugly acts. Holmes opened the book. The handwriting was hurried in places, meticulous in others, like a man trying to balance secrecy and pride. Addresses were listed without official formatting. Times were noted with peculiar care. Besides some entries were initials, not of workers but of customers, letters that meant nothing yet but would mean everything once connected. Holmes's eyes moved quickly. "Hums," he murmured. Watson watched as Holmes's finger paused at an entry. The lane, the district, a time written with a precision that made Watson's stomach tighten. "Last night." A maintenance call, recorded not as a failure but as an adjustment. The name beside it was not a worker, S, but an initial pair, 2 letters enclosed in a small circle. Holmes's expression did not change, but Watson knew the look. Holmes had found the first hard point of the case, the place where the lie had to hold weight. He closed the book gently, as if it were fragile. "Thank you," Holmes said to Abel, and the politeness of it was almost worse than accusation. Abel's face flushed. "I didn't kill anyone," he said quickly. We respond to requests. Men with influence make requests. If we refuse, we lose contracts. We lose work. We have families. You know how it is." Holmes's eyes were steady. "I know," he said, "how men justify themselves. It is one of London's most abundant resources." Watson felt the urge to say something, some reminder that most men did not wake intending to become accomplices to murder. But the memory of Henry Talbot's folded body in the lane silenced him. A man had died, the lantern had gone dark, and here, in a foreman's cabinet, the darkness had been written down. Outside the gasworks, the city already buzzed with another story, simpler, louder, more satisfying to those who liked their villains obvious. As they stepped back into the street, a newspaper boy's voice cut through the damp air. "Murder in the fog, soldier suspected, Bloody Lane death." Watson's shoulders tightened. He saw a small crowd gathered around a newsstand, faces intent, hungry. They read the printed words like scripture, and each sentence fed the creature that lived in the public mind, the need for a culprit. Holmes bought a paper, glanced at it, and folded it as if it were distasteful. "They have found their man already," Watson said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "A man," Holmes corrected, "not the man." The article described a destitute ex-soldier, Thomas Rook, recently returned, seen limping near the lane. The paper painted him in convenient strokes: hollow eyes, unshaven face, the roughness of a life that did not fit neatly into drawing rooms. It spoke of violent tendencies as though poverty itself were a crime. It hinted at drink, at desperation, at a mind unbalanced by war. Watson felt a familiar anger rise. the old disgust at how quickly society decided who deserved mercy. Lestrade will be pressed, Watson said. They will demand an arrest. Holmes's mouth tightened. And he will be tempted, Holmes replied, because an arrest ends questions. The public does not love truth, it loves closure. They walked toward the lane where Talbot had died. The fog had thinned but not vanished. It still lingered in corners, still clung to brickwork, still softened the line between one street and the next. The lane itself was narrower than Watson remembered from the first report, its walls close enough to make a man feel watched. In daylight, it looked less sinister and more sad, an unremarkable passage where lives brushed past each other unseen. Holmes stopped at the mouth of the lane and stood very still. "Tell me," Holmes said, "what does a witness truly see?" Watson frowned. "The event," he said, "the person, the action." Holmes shook his head slightly. "A witness sees what the light allows," Holmes said, "and what fear permits." He stepped into the lane, eyes moving up to the lantern post at the far end. The street lantern was unlit now, harmless in daylight, but its glass casing caught the pale light and reflected it in faint, warped shapes. Holmes walked the length of the lane with measured steps, then turned and looked back. "Mr. Pierce said he stood near the mouth," Holmes said. "He said he saw a face clearly when the lantern flared again. Let us test it." He placed Watson at the mouth of the lane, then walked to a point near the lantern and turned his back. Holmes adjusted his coat collar, lowered his head slightly, and asked in a voice that carried without shouting, "Describe me." Watson hesitated, then did as instructed. "I see your height," he said, "your posture, the line of your shoulders, your hair dark, the shape of your head." "And my face," Holmes called. Watson squinted. The fog did not fully obscure, but it softened. In the lane's narrowness, the light fell unevenly. Holmes's features were not clear, they were an impression. "I cannot be precise," Watson admitted. "Not at this distance, not in this light." Holmes turned and walked back toward him. "Exactly," Holmes said. "Now imagine night. Imagine fog thick enough to make each lantern's circle of light feel like an island. Imagine the lantern goes out, then flares. In that instant, the eye adjusts, the pupil fights, and a man tells you he saw a face clearly enough to swear to it." Watson looked down the lane again, and the lie in Pierce's statement grew heavier, like wet cloth. Holmes moved to the side, near the wall, and crouched, examining the ground. His fingers traced the damp stones without touching them, as if reading a text written in grime. He stood, walked a few paces, stopped again. "The witness could only have seen what he claims," Holmes said, "if he stood here." He pointed to a spot directly beneath the street lantern. Watson's stomach tightened. That position was not near the mouth. It was deep in the lane, close to where Talbot had fallen. It was the position of someone who had not been a distant observer, but a participant in proximity. "And if Pierce stood here," Watson said slowly, "then he was nearer than he told us. Near enough to—" "Smell of oil," Holmes finished quietly, "near enough to handle light." Watson felt the emotional weight shift. This was no longer simply a puzzle of mechanics. It was a human being positioned in a lie like a pawn placed carefully on a board. Holmes rose and brushed his gloves together, though nothing clung to them. "There is rehearsal in his speech," Holmes said, "the little phrases that fit too neatly. The way his fear flares when asked about the lantern. He is not inventing at random, he is repeating." Watson thought of Pierce's trembling hands, the frayed hat brim, the panic that had struck him like a blow at the simplest question. He thought of the smell, persistent, undeniable. "Someone is coaching him," Watson said. Holmes nodded. "And not only coaching," Holmes said. "Managing, guiding him toward the truth they need the world to believe. As they left the lane, they found themselves forced to move through pockets of the city where rumor had already hardened into certainty. In a small coffee house near the main road, men spoke loudly over cups that steamed with bitter warmth. "Soldier did it," one said, voice thick with conviction. "Saw him myself, limping like a guilty man." "A man comes back from war with nothing," another added, as if poverty were a motive that needed no further detail. "What else can he do but steal?" Watson felt his jaw tighten. Holmes did not argue with them. He rarely did. A crowd was not a mind, it was a tide. You did not debate a tide. You built a barrier or you waited for it to turn. But Holmes watched, he listened, not for facts but for the shape of influence. It was in that coffee house that they first saw him, the well-dressed figure who moved through the room as though he belonged to every corner of it. He was not flamboyant, he did not shout, his hair was neatly groomed, his coat was tailored, his gloves clean. He carried himself with the calm authority of a man who believed his concern was a virtue. He spoke to the proprietor in a low voice, then to a small cluster of patrons, and as he spoke, Watson saw the room's temperature change. The men leaned in, they nodded, they felt, suddenly, reassured, because a respectable man was telling them what to fear and what to demand. Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Who is that?" Watson asked quietly. Holmes's voice was barely above breath. "An advocate," he said, "a man who sells safety, and like all merchants, he requires a market." They watched as the man, this public safety advocate, steered the conversation gently but firmly toward outrage. He spoke of rising crime, of darkness as a menace, of the need for swift, visible justice. He offered sympathy for the dead man's family, and in the same breath, he offered a villain the crowd could swallow without choking. "The police must act decisively," the advocate said, voice smooth. "The city cannot be held hostage by the lawless. If a suspect is known, he must be taken. Hesitation is indulgence." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with fog. The man spoke as if he were protecting London, but his words did not soothe. They sharpened. They narrowed the world to one demanded outcome. Holmes leaned slightly toward Watson. "He does not want a murderer," Holmes murmured. "He wants a lesson." Watson watched the advocate move toward the door. As he passed, his eyes swept the room, and for a fraction of a second they met Holmes's. The advocate's expression did not change. He gave a polite nod, as if acknowledging another respectable man, but Watson felt the meaning beneath it, the unspoken exchange. "I see you. I know you are watching." The man left, and the room continued to buzz in his wake, like a nest stirred. Outside, the fog had thickened again, creeping back in, as though the city's daylight had been only an interruption. Holmes guided Watson away from the coffee house and back toward Baker Street. He walked faster now, not in haste but in pursuit, because something had shifted. The case had widened. It was no longer merely about a lantern and a body. It was about pressure, influence, the way fear could be distributed like gas through pipes. As they approached their lodgings, Holmes's pace slowed, and Watson saw him glance up at the windows of 221B with a quick assessment, as if measuring whether the familiar place had remained safe in their absence. Inside, Mrs. Hudson met them with a worried look. "Someone came while you were out," she said. "A boy. He said it was for Mr. Holmes." She held out a small folded paper, edges damp. Holmes took it without comment, his fingers careful at the corners. He did not open it immediately. He smelled it first, an odd gesture that told Watson everything about Holmes's mind. Holmes treated every object as if it had a history and a hand behind it. Then he unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, the words were plain, and for that very reason they landed like a weight. Stop chasing the light, or you will lose someone you cannot replace. Watson felt the blood drain from his face as he read over Holmes's shoulder. The threat did not shout. It did not need to. It did what the best threats always did. It named a vulnerability. Holmes folded the note again, carefully, and slipped it into his pocket as if it were another piece of evidence, not a blade. Watson searched Holmes's face for anger, for fear, for any sign that the warning had struck home. Holmes's expression remained composed, but his eyes had sharpened into something colder. "They know where we live," Watson said quietly. "They know," Holmes replied, "that I will not be frightened into blindness." Watson's thoughts raced to Elijah Pierce, sitting in some public tea room, hands still trembling, trying to believe Holmes's instructions could protect him. Watson imagined the witness's frightened eyes. He imagined a polite man with papers and a badge. He imagined the city's lamps being dimmed at will. Holmes moved to the mantel and stood still for a moment, as if listening to a sound that lay beneath the ordinary noises of the street. Then he spoke, and his voice had that calm finality that always preceded action. "Someone has begun to treat light as a weapon," Holmes said, "and testimony as ammunition. If we want to stop what happened in that lane from happening again, we must find the hand that turns the valve." He reached for his coat again, already moving toward the next step, and Watson felt the case tighten around them like fog thickening into something with intent. Because now it was not only a dead man in a lane. It was a living witness, a public hungry for an easy villain, and a quiet threat delivered directly to the hearth of Baker Street, promising that the next darkness would be personal. The warning note sat in Holmes's pocket like a live coal, small, contained, and capable of burning through any illusion of safety if handled carelessly. Watson had not slept well. He lay awake listening to London's night noises soften under fog, thinking of the line in the note, "Someone you cannot replace," and hearing it in different voices each time. Mrs. Hudson's step on the stairs, a carriage passing too slowly, the creak of the building settling. Every harmless sound became a question. Was it ordinary or a signal? By morning, the city had decided what it wanted to believe. The papers continued to sell their story of the limping ex-soldier as if guilt were a stain that could be seen through fog. Posters appeared in windows. Names were repeated with the hungry insistence of people who needed the world to be simple. Watson saw it in faces, on the pavement outside the newsstand, in the set of a man's jaw as he read, in the contempt with which a passerby spat the word soldier as if it were interchangeable with thief. Holmes refused to begin the day by looking outward. He began by moving a chair slightly, as if aligning the room to his thoughts, and then turning to Watson with that quiet certainty that made everything else feel like distraction. "Before we chase any club, any advocate, any ledger," Holmes said, "we secure the one human being used as a hinge." "Elijah Pierce," Watson answered. Holmes nodded once. Watson thought of Pierce's trembling hands, the scent of lamp oil, the way his eyes had searched the room for exits. He remembered the instruction Holmes had given him: keep him in public, keep him visible, and the unspoken fear beneath it: men disappear more easily than evidence. Watson had taken Pierce to a tea room the day before, a place where the warmth of cups and the busy movement of waiters made danger feel less likely. Pierce had sat with his back to the wall and his hat on his knees like a shield. He had tried to sip without rattling the saucer. He had flinched every time the door opened. "You did not tell me you were so frightened," Watson had said, softly, not as accusation, but as a doctor's observation. Pierce's eyes had filled and emptied again, like a tide held back by shame. "I'm not a brave man," he had whispered. "I'm not like him." "Like whom?" Watson had asked. Pierce had swallowed and looked away. Like you, he said, men who can stand upright when the world leans on them. Watson had wanted to insist it was not courage that kept him upright, but habit. That fear became manageable only when shared, but Pierce's fear was solitary, cultivated, owned. Now, with the threat note fresh and the city's anger growing, Holmes insisted they bring Pierce to Baker Street, despite the risk of having their address known, because the greater danger lay in leaving him accessible to those who already knew how to reach him. They sent for him with care, choosing a route and a messenger that would not be easily traced. When Pierce arrived near noon, he looked as though he had walked through every shadow in London to get there. His coat was buttoned to the throat. His cheeks were raw with cold. His eyes kept lifting to the stairwell behind him, as if expecting footsteps. Mrs. Hudson served tea with trembling composure, and even she, used to strange visitors and sudden alarms, seemed unsettled by the way Pierce's gaze kept flicking to the windows, to the door, to the coat stand. Holmes did not begin with questions. He began with kindness shaped into practicality. "You will sit," Holmes said. "You will drink, you will breathe, and you will tell me what you have not told the police." Pierce's hands tightened around his cup. Steam rose and vanished into foggy air seeping in through imperfect seals. The warmth did not reach his eyes. "I've told everything," Pierce said, voice brittle. Holmes leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, the posture of a man lowering himself into another's fear without flinching. "No," Holmes said, "you have repeated everything." Pierce flinched as if struck. Watson watched his throat work, the swallow that did nothing to ease him. Holmes's voice softened, not into sentiment, but into clarity. "Mr. Pierce," Holmes said, "a man died. His name was Henry Talbot. His watch stopped at the same minute the street lantern went dark. Someone collected your lantern before I could examine it. Someone delivered a warning to me here. These are not the acts of a simple thief. They are the acts of people who plan." Pierce's eyes darted to the door. Holmes followed the glance with his own, then returned to Pierce. "I am not asking you to be brave," Holmes said. "I am offering you protection, but protection has a price. It requires truth." Pierce's lower lip trembled. For a moment Watson thought he might speak, might let the words spill out in relief like blood from a wound finally opened. His shoulders sagged slightly, and his eyes glistened with something that looked like surrender. Then there was a knock. It was not the frantic knock of a man in panic. It was controlled. 3 taps, measured, polite. Pierce went rigid. The cup in his hands rattled against the saucer, a small sound that seemed enormous in the room's sudden quiet. Mrs. Hudson glanced at Holmes, then moved toward the stairs with the hesitant obedience of someone used to Holmes's strange visitors, yet aware that this one might come carrying teeth. Holmes lifted a hand. "I will answer," he said. He descended, Watson following, Pierce frozen behind them like a man pinned to his chair by invisible hands. At the door stood a gentleman in a well-cut coat, scarf arranged with deliberate care, hat held just so. His face wore the pleasant calm of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He smiled with practiced warmth, eyes attentive in a way that might have passed for concern if one did not look too closely. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, "how fortunate. I feared I might be too late." Holmes's gaze remained unreadable. "And you are?" Holmes asked. "Caleb Pierce," the man replied smoothly, stepping forward as if already belonging in the hall. "Elijah's cousin. I only heard this morning that he had been brought into the matter, and I confess I have been beside myself with worry. London is not kind to men caught in such stories." The man's eyes flicked, quick and assessing, to Watson, to the stairwell, to the umbrella stand. He missed nothing and pretended he had noticed nothing at all. Holmes's tone remained courteous. How thoughtful, Holmes said, and how swift. Caleb Pierce's smile did not falter. Family has its duties. Watson watched the man's hands. They were clean. The nails were trimmed. No trace of work, no trace of oil. Yet his fingers held the hat with the same careful control Pierce had shown, only without fear. It was the pose of a man who had learned that appearing harmless was a skill. Holmes stepped aside slightly to allow him in. Not hospitality, strategy. Upstairs, Elijah Pierce rose from his chair the instant his cousin entered. His face blanched, then flushed, then settled into a sickly pallor. He tried to smile, and the attempt looked like pain. "Caleb," he said. "My poor boy," Caleb replied, crossing the room with the ease of a man walking into property he already considered his. "What have you done to yourself? They're turning you into a spectacle." He did not embrace Elijah, though he spoke as if he might. He simply placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a touch that looked affectionate to an outsider and felt, Watson suspected, like a reminder of ownership. Holmes waited until the room settled, until Caleb had taken in the scene and the placement of each person. Then Holmes began again, but in a new shape. He did not confront. He invited the lie to reveal its seams. "Mr. Pierce," Holmes said to Elijah, "you said the lantern went out, then flared, and you saw the face clearly. Tell me, what color was the flame when it returned?" Elijah blinked, thrown. The question sounded like small talk. It sounded like the kind of curiosity that could not possibly threaten anyone. "Color," Elijah stammered. It was yellow, I suppose, like fire." Holmes nodded as if considering. "And steady?" Holmes asked. "Or did it flutter? Was there a blue edge at the base?" Elijah's breath hitched. He looked to Caleb without meaning to, eyes seeking rescue. Caleb smiled. "It was a warm white," Caleb said smoothly. "A proper mantle glow. Not much blue at all unless the pressure is low." The room went still in a different way, not with fear now, but with revelation. Holmes's eyes rested on Caleb with polite interest. "How very precise," Holmes said. "You speak as though you have spent time studying gas mantles." Caleb's smile sharpened slightly. "A man reads," he said. "One picks up knowledge." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Yet most men, even well-read ones, do not distinguish between a warm mantle glow and a pressure-related blue edge without having had reason to notice it." Caleb's eyes remained calm. "Perhaps I am more observant than most." Holmes leaned back, letting the air hang heavy. Watson watched Elijah Pierce's shoulders sag, the shame in his face now raw. He had not only been caught in a lie, he had been corrected in his lie by the very man who claimed to protect him. And that correction had exposed what Elijah had likely known all along. The truth of who held the lantern was sitting politely in their room. Holmes turned his attention gently back to Elijah. "Mr. Pierce," Holmes said, "you have just been rescued from a question that would have embarrassed you. Ask yourself why." Elijah's eyes filled. He looked down at his hands, at the cup, at the little crescent of moisture on the saucer. Caleb's tone softened. "Elijah is under strain," he said. "You must understand, he is not a criminal. He's only a man who happened to witness something dreadful. I have come to take him home. He needs rest. He needs family." Holmes's gaze did not flicker. "And he needs," Holmes said, "to remain alive." Caleb's smile was faint now, as if he were indulging a melodramatic friend. "Of course," Caleb said, "that is precisely why I am here." Watson felt the tension rise, the way it did when two men spoke politely while measuring each other's limits. Holmes did not bar the door. He did not accuse Caleb outright. He did something subtler. He watched Caleb's attention drift again and again toward Elijah's coat pocket, toward the note perhaps, toward anything that might contain what Elijah had been told to carry. Holmes stood. "Before you go," Holmes said, "there is a small matter of clarification. Mr. Pierce, earlier you described the killer's face. You changed the hair color. You spoke of a cap, yet you insist you saw clearly. Would you be so kind as to sign your statement again here, in my presence, with these details fixed?" Elijah's head jerked up. His face twisted with panic. He glanced at Caleb. Caleb's eyes, for the first time, held something harder than charm. "There is no need," Caleb said quickly. "His statement is already with the police." "Then there is no harm in repeating it," Holmes replied. Watson watched Elijah's hands begin to shake, not with nervousness now, but with something like despair. He looked at Holmes as if begging, not to be forced, not to be broken open. Holmes's voice softened. "Mr. Pierce," Holmes said, "I am not your enemy, but I cannot protect what I cannot name." Elijah's lips parted. He seemed about to speak, to confess, to finally let the truth take air. Caleb stood at once. "This is enough," he said, voice still controlled but now edged. "You are frightening him. You are making a sick man worse. Elijah, we are leaving." Elijah did not move. His eyes flicked between them like an animal caught between two doors, neither safe. Holmes stepped slightly to the side, not blocking, not yielding. Watson felt the weight of choice in the room. If they forced Elijah to stay, they might push him deeper into panic. If they let him go with Caleb, they might hand him back into the very machinery that had rehearsed him. Holmes spoke, not loudly, but with a finality that turned the air. "Elijah," Holmes said quietly, "look at me. Do you want to go with him?" Elijah's mouth worked, his eyes brimmed. I don't know," he whispered. Caleb's hand hovered near Elijah's shoulder again, a touch ready to guide. Holmes's gaze shifted to Caleb, and the courtesy in his voice became something like steel wrapped in velvet. "Then you will not take him," Holmes said. "Not today, not until I am satisfied you are what you claim." Caleb's smile returned, thin, controlled. "You overstep," Caleb said. "This is family." Holmes nodded lightly. "And I am the man family seeks when law and comfort fail," Holmes said. "So let us keep our steps measured." Caleb held Holmes's gaze for a long moment, and in that pause Watson felt the true contest. Not physical, not loud, but psychological. Caleb was weighing what he could do openly, what he could do quietly, what he could do later. Then Caleb inclined his head, as if conceding out of reason rather than necessity. "Very well," he said. "Elijah, I will return when you have rested. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, good day." He took his hat, turned, and left without haste. But when the door closed, Elijah Pierce collapsed back into the chair, as though his bones had been holding him up through will alone. Watson moved quickly, kneeling beside him, doctor first, investigator second. Elijah's pulse fluttered under Watson's fingers like a trapped bird. "He owns me," Elijah whispered, voice breaking. "He owns me because I signed." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Signed what?" Holmes asked. Elijah covered his face with his hands, ashamed to let anyone see the tears he could not stop. "It was years ago," he said, words muffled. "A different case, a fire, a woman injured. They needed someone to blame. I was in the wrong place. Caleb, he was not my cousin then. He was a clerk, a man who knew how to speak to me like he was doing me a kindness." Watson listened, heart tightening. He had seen men destroyed not by a single blow, but by a slow tightening noose of obligation and shame. "He said," Elijah continued, "it would be simple, just a statement, just a signature. I didn't understand what it would do. I didn't understand how a piece of ink can become a chain. Holmes spoke gently, but without softness that could be mistaken for pity. And now, when they need a witness again, Holmes said, they pull the chain. Elijah nodded, sobbing quietly. I didn't want to hurt anyone, he whispered, but when they came to me, they said I could make things right. They said the city needed order. They said the man in the lane was dangerous. They said if I helped, the old paper would never surface. Watson felt his own anger rise, not at Elijah, but at the men who weaponized a frightened soul. Holmes's expression remained composed, yet Watson could see the tightening at the corner of his mouth. Holmes hated cruelty most when it wore a respectable face. Listen to me, Holmes said to Elijah, and listen carefully. You are not beyond redemption because you signed a lie once. You have been frightened into repeating it, but there is still a choice in you, and I need you to choose wisely. Elijah lifted his head. His eyes were red, and yet there was something in them now, desperation turning into resolve, like a man who realizes running will not save him. What do you need? Elijah whispered. Holmes did not answer immediately. He moved to the table where the clandestine gas ledger lay open, and beside it the scrap of glass he had obtained earlier, thin, sharp-edged, wrapped carefully in paper. He placed it down gently and unfolded it with the reverence of a man handling truth. The glass was part of a lantern chimney, and on its surface, etched faintly, was a symbol, small, deliberate, not random damage. A pair of letters enclosed within a circle, matching the mark in Abel's private ledger. Elijah's eyes widened. I've seen that, Elijah whispered. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Where? Holmes asked. Elijah swallowed. On papers, he said, on envelopes, seals, they call it the circle. They say it means order, it means protection, it means you don't speak. Watson felt the case deepen, moving from a single murder into something older and broader, a network that hid behind civic language and polite gestures. Holmes closed the paper around the glass again. You will tell us everything you know, Holmes said. Not later, not when it is safer, because safety is being negotiated without your consent. You will tell us now while you still can. Elijah's hands clenched. The dead man, he said suddenly. Henry Talbot, he wasn't random. Holmes and Watson both stilled. Elijah's voice shook, but the words came faster now, as if the truth, once allowed, could not be held back. He carried documents, Elijah said. I didn't see them, not fully, but I knew he had them because Caleb said so. He said Talbot worked in a solicitor's office and had copied papers he shouldn't have. Papers about the gasworks, about calls that weren't logged, about bribes, contracts, names. He said Talbot thought he could sell them or expose them. He said Talbot would be made an example. Watson felt a coldness settle in him. The murder was not opportunistic, it was instructional. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And you, Holmes said, were placed in the lane to witness. Not truly to witness, but to certify. Elijah nodded, tears spilling again. They told me where to stand, he whispered. They told me what to say. They said the lantern would fail for a moment, and in that moment I would hear a sound, and then I would see a man running. They told me to remember the limp. They told me to say soldier if anyone asked what kind of man. Watson's jaw clenched. And the ex-soldier, Watson said, voice tight. Thomas Rook, he's being offered to the city like meat. Elijah nodded miserably. I didn't know his name, Elijah whispered, only that he was convenient. Holmes's voice turned quieter still, the way it did when the center of a problem had been touched. Mr. Pierce, Holmes said, if you tell the whole truth, you will be hunted. Elijah looked up, eyes raw. "I'm hunted already," he said. Holmes held his gaze. "Then we will do this properly," Holmes said. "We will place you where you can speak and be heard, and where their hands cannot reach you without showing themselves." Watson felt the moment shift, a midpoint pressure, not only for the case, but for the human being caught inside it. Elijah Pierce was no longer only a witness. He was a man standing at the edge of his own ruin, deciding whether to fall quietly or fight for air. Holmes moved toward the window, peering out into the fog, as if trying to see through the city's skin. "They mate," Holmes said, almost to himself. "Men like this always meet. They cannot resist the reassurance of each other's company." Watson looked at him. "The club," he said, remembering the advocate's presence, the polished calm with which fear had been sold in a coffee house. Holmes nodded. "And now," Holmes said, "we follow." He turned back to Elijah. "You will remain here," Holmes said. "In this room, with Mrs. Hudson close by, and with Dr. Watson making certain you do not collapse from fear. You will be guarded." Elijah's eyes widened. "By whom?" Holmes's mouth tightened slightly. "By me," he said, and then softer, "and by the fact that I intend to make them move before they make you vanish." Watson helped Elijah to the settee near the fire. Elijah's hands still shook, but there was a new quality in his trembling, less helplessness, more strain, as though his body were adjusting to the idea of resistance. Holmes and Watson left the house shortly after, moving out into fog that seemed thicker than before, as if London itself were listening. They did not follow Caleb directly from Baker Street. Holmes understood the danger of appearing obvious. Instead, he positioned them near the coffee house where they had first seen the public safety advocate, and waited with a stillness that made the world pass around him. When Caleb finally appeared, coat immaculate, pace measured, Holmes's gaze sharpened and then softened again, the look of a hunter who knows when to remain unseen. They followed at a distance, keeping to the edges of streets, using carts and crowds as moving cover. Fog helped, turning outlines into uncertainty. It made following easier and harder at once, easier to slip, harder to be sure. Caleb moved with purpose, not wandering, not hesitating. He turned down streets that grew cleaner, wealthier, quieter. The lamps here were better maintained, the pavements less broken. Order lived openly. He stopped at a discreet door tucked between respectable fronts. No sign, no advertisement, only a brass plate with a small, tasteful emblem, too plain to draw attention, too deliberate to be meaningless. Holmes paused across the street, eyes narrowed. "Do you say it?" Holmes murmured. Watson squinted. The emblem was faint, but there, 2 letters within a circle, polished so that it could vanish into reflection unless you knew to look. "The circle," Watson whispered. Holmes's gaze held the door as Caleb vanished inside. They did not enter immediately. Holmes waited, counting minutes with the patience of a man who knew that timing was half of truth. Then, when the flow of other respectable men began, one then another, coats brushed, hats held just so, they moved. Inside, the air changed. It was warmer, perfumed faintly with tobacco and expensive spirits. The hum of conversation was controlled, not loud. Men laughed softly, like people laughing at something they had already agreed was amusing. The place was designed to make conspiracies feel like civility. Holmes and Watson moved through it like shadows that did not belong but were not questioned, because respectable rooms often assumed respectability in anyone who wore the right coat and held his head with the right calm. They found the back room by the sound, voices lower, deliberate. Holmes paused near a half-closed door, just enough to listen without appearing to listen. Inside, men spoke of illumination not as a utility, but as a principle. They spoke of order as if it were a moral duty. They spoke of darkness, not as an accident, but as a tool. Fear makes people grateful, one voice said, smooth and confident, and grateful people do not ask inconvenient questions. Another murmured agreement. A city must learn that obedience is safety. Watson felt a chill, hearing civic language used like a knife. Then a familiar voice, polished, calm, unmistakable. The public safety advocate. London wants certainty, the advocate said. Give it a villain and it will forgive the methods. We are not merely protecting the city, we are instructing it. Holmes's jaw tightened. Watson could feel the case's shape clarifying, not random evil, but organized influence. Holmes withdrew from the door, motioning Watson away. They had learned enough for the moment, and staying longer risked becoming visible. They slipped out as they had come, Fogg greeting them like an accomplice. Back at Baker Street, dusk had begun to fall early, as it always did in winter. The lamps outside had already been lit, their glow soft and unreliable in the damp air. Inside, Mrs. Hudson met them with a strained face. "He's been asking for you," she whispered. "He says he's ready. He says he can't carry it anymore." They hurried upstairs. Elijah Pierce sat rigidly on the settee, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the door as if he had been holding himself together by staring at the exact point where truth would enter. When he saw Holmes, something in him loosened, not relief, resolve. "I'll tell you," Elijah said, voice shaking but steady enough to hold. "All of it, the old paper, the names, the way they made me stand beneath the lantern. The man who came to collect my lantern wasn't from the gasworks at all. He wore their badge, but his hands were too clean, and he said something before he left." Holmes leaned in slightly. "What did he say?" Holmes asked. Elijah swallowed hard. "He said," Elijah whispered, "that if I ever tried to be honest, I'd disappear like a flame in fog." Watson felt his stomach tighten. Holmes's voice was calm, but the air around it sharpened. "Then speak," Holmes said, "now." Elijah drew a breath that looked like it hurt. And as he opened his mouth to finally unseal the truth, the room's quiet seemed to thicken, like the pause before a lantern goes dark, because somewhere in the house below them, there came a soft sound that did not belong. The faint scrape of a match. And the smell, sudden and unmistakable, of fresh lamp oil. The scrape of a match below them, and the sudden, clean sting of fresh lamp oil in the air, did not feel like a sound or a smell so much as a message. Someone was close enough to reach into the house and remind them that truth could be snuffed out as easily as flame. Holmes did not move like a man startled. He moved like a man confirming what he had already suspected. One hand lifted, palm down, a silent command for stillness. Watson rose from the chair without thinking, the doctor's instinct replaced by something older and sharper, the protective urge that comes when a frightened human being is finally about to speak, and the world chooses that moment to interfere. Elijah Pierce's eyes had gone wide, fixed on the doorway as though he could see through wood and plaster. His mouth was still open, the confession paused on the edge of becoming real. Holmes crossed the room with quiet speed and placed himself between Elijah and the stairs, not blocking a weapon but blocking panic. He listened. Below, the house held its breath. No heavy tread, no clumsy intrusion, only the faintest rustle like cloth shifting. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said softly without turning his head, "stay in your room. Do not come down." Watson heard the old landlady's muffled gasp from the landing and the quick retreat of her slippers. The house became a sealed thing, 3 men and a truth trapped inside it. Holmes reached the top of the stairs and paused, 1 foot lowered but not committed. He did not rush into darkness. He waited for darkness to betray itself. Another sound, small, careful, the faint click of a metal cap. Watson's mind catalogued details automatically. Lamp oil, a match, the click of a cap. Someone had brought a lantern, or something like it. Not a man intending to set fire recklessly. A man intending to leave a signature. Holmes descended one step, then another, his movements so controlled that even the creak of the wood seemed reluctant to announce him. Watson followed, keeping his own breath shallow, aware that their every sound could be interpreted by someone below as a measure of how frightened they were. At the bottom, the hall was dim. The daylight outside had collapsed into early evening, and the gaslight from the street filtered in weakly through the front window, tinting the air a sickly gold. The fog pressed against the glass as if trying to push its way into the room. Holmes's eyes flicked to the coat stand, to the umbrella rack, to the door. Then to the small table by the wall where Mrs. Hudson kept a tray for letters. There, resting perfectly centered, as though placed by a hand that cared about presentation, was a match burned down to its very end. Beside it, a smear of lamp oil, dark and glossy, like a thumbprint left by someone who wanted them to notice. No intruder remained. Whoever had come had already gone, slipping away as smoothly as the fog itself. Watson's pulse pounded in his ears, half anger, half relief. He looked back up the stairs. "Elijah," he called, keeping his voice low, "stay where you are." They returned to the sitting room quickly, but not noisily. Watson's mind raced with possibilities. Had the visitor come merely to frighten or to take? The house was intact. No drawers yanked open, no furniture disturbed. Yet the feeling of violation was absolute. It is one thing to be threatened by letter. It is another to have a stranger walk through your hall and leave the smell of oil behind, as if to say, your walls do not matter. Elijah Pierce was no longer on the settee. Watson froze, disbelief cutting through him like ice. For a fraction of a second, he saw only the empty cushion, the cup still on the table with its surface gone cold, the slight depression where Elijah's weight had been, already relaxing into absence. Holmes moved to the window in one swift glide and looked down to the street, scanning for a retreating silhouette. Watson rushed to the adjoining room, then to the small bedroom. No Elijah, only the neatness of a man who had been placed and removed without struggle. "How?" Watson began, voice cracking with fury. Holmes turned from the window, and his face was pale not with fear but with concentration, as if his mind had tightened into a tool. "Not through the front," Holmes said. "There would be noise, there would be eyes. He has been taken as quietly as he was placed in that lane." Watson's hands clenched. The promise in the warning note, "Lose someone you cannot replace," now felt like a bruise under the skin. They had not merely threatened, they had demonstrated. Holmes moved to the fire where the poker rested. He did not touch it. He touched the edge of the mantel instead, and then the curtain cord, and then the window latch. He was not searching for Elijah. He was reconstructing the path of the thief. Watson forced himself to breathe, to think like a doctor and an investigator rather than a furious friend. "Elijah wouldn't leave willingly," Watson said, not when he was finally ready to speak. Holmes's gaze flicked toward the back door. "No," Holmes agreed. He was removed in the precise moment when he was about to stop being useful to them. The city did not pause for their personal dread. Outside, London continued to churn. Newspapers were being shouted. Men were already choosing their villain. And now, with the witness missing, the machine that Holmes had glimpsed behind civic language would have even less resistance. Without Elijah Pierce, the story would revert to what it had always been designed to become: simple, satisfying, violent. It did not take long for Lestrade to appear. He arrived in the sharp half-light of late evening, boots damp, face strained. His eyes took in the room's order, the match on the tray, the oily smear, and then the emptiness where the witness should have been. He swore softly, not theatrically, but with real frustration. You had him here, Lestrade said, the accusation and plea mingling together. Holmes, for God's sake, why would you bring him here if you couldn't hold him? Holmes did not bristle. He rarely did with Lestrade, perhaps because he recognized that the inspector's bluster was often a cloak for an honest man's helplessness. I brought him here, Holmes said, because the alternative was to leave him in public places where men can vanish without any trace at all. At least here, they were forced to show a hand. Lestrade's jaw tightened. A hand, he snapped. The papers are screaming, the public is screaming, and now my witness has vanished in your very house. Do you know what that means? It means I have nothing but the ex-soldier and the crowd's appetite. Watson saw it now, the crack running through Lestrade's composure. The inspector was being pushed from all sides, by politics, by press, by the advocate's polished demands for decisive action. A man like Lestrade, who wanted order in the honest sense, was being made into a weapon for another kind of order. You can't arrest Thomas Rook, Watson said, unable to keep it from his voice. Not on this. Lestrade's eyes flashed. Not on this, he said. A man is dead. Another man was seen limping near the lane, and every hour that passes without an arrest, I look like a fool. Holmes stepped forward slightly. You are not a fool, Holmes said. You are being steered. Lestrade gave a bitter laugh. By whom? He demanded. The fog, the newspapers, your invisible club of gentlemen who speak of illumination. Holmes's gaze held his. By whoever can turn a lantern off, Holmes said evenly, and by whoever has already proven he can turn a witness into smoke. Lestrade's face hardened, but the hardness did not fully conceal his fear not of the criminal, but of the consequences of resisting the public's roar. I will arrest him by morning if I must, Lestrade said, voice lower now, because the Home Office will demand it, because the advocate, Hargreaves, that smooth devil, keeps visiting my superiors and reminding them what panic looks like. Holmes's eyes sharpened at the name. Hargreaves, Holmes repeated softly, committing it to place. Watson felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The advocate now had a name, and names were handles. Lestrade looked between them, then shook his head, as if trying to dislodge a bad dream. You always make things larger, he said, exhaustion seeping in. A dead man becomes a conspiracy. A lantern becomes a weapon. Fine, prove it, Holmes. Prove the light was engineered. Prove the testimony was manufactured. And do it quickly, because London isn't interested in proof. Holmes nodded once, as if Lestrade had finally said the only useful thing. We will, Holmes said. After Lestrade left, the room felt colder, though the fire still burned. Mrs. Hudson hovered at the door with eyes full of worry, and Watson found himself unable to reassure her with anything honest. Holmes did not sit. He moved to the table and spread his materials, Abel's clandestine ledger, the scrap of etched lantern glass, the folded warning note. Watson watched him place each object with exactness, as if building a map the mind could walk. Then Holmes began to reconstruct. He spoke not in grand deductions, but in the language of measurement. The lane, Holmes said, is 16 paces from mouth to lantern. The lantern is mounted at a height of 12 feet. Its glass casing produces a halo of approximately 9 feet in clear weather, less in fog. Wind last night, west by southwest, mild but persistent. That matters because a mantle flame behaves differently under draft. Watson listened, feeling the case shift from emotional threat back into the hard spine of logic. Holmes did not let dread become fog in his own mind. He used it as pressure to sharpen the blade. The watch, Holmes continued, stopped at the minute the lantern went dark. A momentary extinguishing could coincide with shock, yes, but the precision suggests coordination. A man can strike at a planned moment. A lantern failing by chance at the same moment is unlikely. Watson nodded. Holmes moved a pencil across paper, drawing a simple sketch: lane walls, lantern post, mouth of the lane, approximate position of the body. He marked the spot where the witness could have seen, and the spot where he must have stood to claim what he claimed. Pierce stood beneath the lantern, Holmes said, or near enough to it that his story only makes sense from that point. He was placed there, and the lantern went out not by Fogg's accident, but by a mechanism. A mechanism at the gasworks, Watson said. Holmes's eyes flicked up. We must see it, Holmes replied. Not in daylight, not with foremen watching, at night when the real apparatus is used. Watson felt a familiar chill. The gasworks at night was not simply dangerous. It was a place where darkness and flame lived together in unnatural intimacy. Men could fall, valves could hiss, shadows could hide intent. Yet Watson did not hesitate. Not now, not with Elijah Pierce taken. The case had become personal by force. They went near midnight, when the city's noise thinned and the fog thickened into a moving wall. The gasworks loomed like a sleeping beast, its iron bones outlined against dim sky. Steam rose from vents, curling into fog so that the whole place seemed to breathe. Holmes moved like he belonged, not through authority, but through confidence. He found a weak point in the perimeter where a gate latch had been repaired too often and no longer fit perfectly. He slipped it with a small tool, and the metal yielded with a reluctant sigh. Inside, everything was larger and stranger than in daylight. The yard's coal piles became black hills. The brick buildings seemed to lane. Lamps cast small circles that looked inadequate against the vast dark. The smell of coal was stronger, and beneath it the metallic tang of gas, faint but insistent, like a warning held in the air. They moved between buildings, keeping to shadow, listening for footsteps. From one window came the low murmur of men at late work. From another, the rhythmic clank of tools. Most of the workers were gone, but not all. A place like this never truly slept. Holmes led Watson to a building whose door was padlocked. The padlock was new, its brass bright. That alone was suspicious. New locks appeared where secrets had recently been noticed. Holmes crouched, examined the lock, then produced a thin piece of metal. His hands moved with practiced care. The lock clicked open with a soft, almost intimate sound. Inside, the air was colder, and the smell of oil stronger. Lantern parts lay stacked on tables. Coils of tubing ran along walls. A faint hiss drifted from somewhere deeper, like a whisper held too long. Holmes moved to a workbench where a set of valves and pressure gauges had been mounted to a board. The board was not official. It had no labels. It looked like the work of a clever man who built it for a purpose he did not want recorded. Watson's heart tightened. It was one thing to theorize, another to see the skeleton of the method. Holmes ran his fingers close to the tubing without touching it, reading its layout like a sentence. This, he murmured, could divert pressure, temporarily, to specific lines. Watson followed the tubing with his eyes. To specific lanterns, he whispered. Holmes nodded. A momentary drop, Holmes said. A dimming, a controlled darkness, not a failure, an instruction. They moved deeper, navigating narrow passages between machinery. Catwalks rose above them, iron rails cold under gloved hands. Below, large tanks sat like blind creatures, their surfaces slick with condensation. The fog pressed against windows in thick sheets, making the world outside look unreal. Watson felt it then, the uncanny sense that the fog was not merely weather, but a collaborator. It hid footsteps. It softened alarms. It made men feel alone even in a crowded city. In a place like this, a man could disappear as Elijah had, quietly, efficiently, leaving only a smell behind. Holmes stopped at another board mounted behind a hanging sheet of canvas. He drew the canvas aside, revealing a second apparatus, a set of switches, simple levers, connected to lines marked only with chalk symbols. And there, on the corner of the board, etched into the wood, the same circle mark. Watson's stomach dropped. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "They sign their work," Holmes said quietly, "not to boast, because they believe no one will ever see." Watson reached out, then stopped himself, aware that touching might disturb something they would later need to show Lestrade. Holmes leaned closer, reading the chalk. He took out a small notebook and wrote down the symbols, copying them exactly. His mind was already mapping which line might lead to the lane, which to other streets, which to lamps the city thought were obedient. A soft sound above them, a footstep on a catwalk. Holmes's head lifted instantly, eyes sharp. Watson held his breath. The footsteps paused, then continued. A man was moving overhead, unhurried, as if doing routine checks. Holmes motioned Watson back into shadow. They waited, listening. The man's boot scraped metal, a faint cough, then silence again. Holmes's gaze returned to the switches. "We have enough," Holmes murmured. "Now we must turn it into pressure." They left as they came, slipping through the yard like ghosts, the smell of gas clinging to their coats. When they returned to Baker Street, the fire had sunk low, and Mrs. Hudson sat half asleep in a chair, jolting awake at their entrance. Holmes did not rest. He sat at the table and began to assemble the next piece of the case, not the machinery now, but the man behind the machinery. Watson watched him lay out paper, ink, and a small stack of documents he had acquired from earlier inquiries, newspaper clippings, court notices, public records. He spoke as he worked, not for drama, but because Watson was part of his process. "Caleb Pierce is not Pierce," Holmes said. "He wears the name like a borrowed coat." Watson's mind flashed back to Caleb's polish, his too attentive corrections, his calm ownership of Elijah's fear. "How do we prove it?" Watson asked. Holmes reached into a drawer and produced a thin file, notes gathered from a solicitor's office near Holborn, where Henry Talbot had worked. Holmes had visited earlier in the day without Watson, moving through the clerks with quiet charm and sharper questions. Talbot, Holmes said, was copying documents, not only about gasworks calls, about a past scandal, an old case of coerced testimony, a fire years ago, a woman injured, a convenient culprit found, a clerk who facilitated the statement. Watson felt cold. Elijah's confession, now stolen from them by force, had been grounded in reality. Holmes opened the file and pointed to a name in faded ink. "Caleb's real name," Holmes said softly, "is Edwin Crowe." Watson lined in. The name meant nothing yet, but Holmes's tone gave it weight. "Disgraced solicitor's clerk," Holmes continued, "removed quietly after allegations of witness tampering, not convicted because men like Crowe do not leave obvious fingerprints, but his name appears in the margins of complaints, in letters, in the kind of whispers that never become court records." Watson felt anger rise again, hot and clean. "He came back," Watson said. Holmes nodded. "With a cleaner face," Holmes said, "and a more dangerous machine." Watson stared at the papers. The emotional peak came not from any grand speech, but from the simple cruelty of it. A man who had learned how to ruin lives with ink and persuasion had now learned how to ruin them with engineered darkness. Outside, London's appetite intensified. By afternoon, the next day's papers were already promising justice. The ex-soldier's name, Thomas Rooke, was being tied to Talbot's death as if with rope. People wanted a handcuff click they could hear. They wanted a story where the villain looked poor enough to be hated without guilt. Lestrade came again, earlier than expected, face drawn. "They're forcing my hand," he said. "Hargreaves has been in my superintendent's office twice today. Twice. He speaks of public confidence, like a man selling furniture." Holmes's eyes hardened. "Then we will sell them a different spectacle," Holmes said. Lestrade frowned. "I don't like the sound of that." "You will," Holmes replied, "when it saves an innocent man from the gallows." Holmes explained quickly. Not the whole truth, not the whole network. Lestrade would choke on that until he had something he could hold in court. Holmes offered him a trap shaped like the conspirator's own addiction: control. "They cannot resist," Holmes said, touching the valve again when something important is at stake. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "And what will be at stake?" Holmes's voice dropped. "The stolen documents Talbot copied," Holmes said. "We will make them believe the papers have resurfaced. We will arrange an exchange beneath a specific lantern. We will let them think they can extinguish the light and take what they want unseen." Watson felt the danger immediately. A trap under a lantern, exactly where Talbot had died, exactly where Elijah had been placed. It was bait and blade together. "And the witness?" Lestrade asked sharply, the question he had been trying not to ask. "If Crowe has him, if your man is truly missing?" Holmes's gaze held steady. "Then Crowe will bring him," Holmes said, "because Crowe's greatest need is not silence, it is control of the narrative. He will want Elijah there to certify the outcome." Watson's chest tightened. They were turning Elijah's captivity into leverage. It was cruel, but perhaps it was the only way to bring him back into the light. Holmes's eyes met Watson's, and in that glance Watson saw the grim arithmetic. If they did nothing, Thomas Rook would be arrested, perhaps condemned, while Elijah would remain vanished and the circle would continue. If they acted, they risked lives, but they might force the machine to reveal itself. That evening, the lantern was chosen, a post on a street that fed into the lane where Talbot had fallen, a place with enough traffic to provide witnesses, and enough fog to make engineered darkness meaningful. Holmes selected it not by whim, but by pipe mapping, a lantern line that, according to the chalk symbols at the gasworks, could be manipulated from the hidden switchboard. Lestrade arranged discreet constables. Not many, too many would spook the conspirators, but enough to close in once the mechanism was triggered. Watson, reluctantly, played his part. He carried a sealed parcel, waited to feel like documents, with a false ribbon and a wax seal that would catch the eye of any man trained to notice such things. Fog rolled in again as twilight deepened. The city's lamps came alive one by one, their halos swelling in mist like pale flowers opening in darkness. They took their positions. Holmes stood near the corner, half-shadowed, his face turned slightly away as if he were merely another man waiting for someone who was late. Watson stood nearer the lantern, parcel tucked beneath his arm, heart beating with controlled dread. Lestrade lingered farther back, his men scattered like quiet stones. Minutes passed, the street murmured with normal life, footsteps, carriage wheels, the distant shout of a vendor. Yet beneath it, Watson felt the unnatural tension of a scene being assembled. A figure appeared down the street, well-dressed, moving with calm purpose. Hargreaves. The public safety advocate's face looked almost kind in lantern light. He approached as though concerned for order itself, as though his presence were a civic service. Then another figure emerged from fog behind him, Caleb Pierce, Edwin Crowe, whatever name he wore tonight. His coat was immaculate. His eyes scanned the street with the quick, predatory attention of a man counting exits. And beside him, held close, not by a visible grip but by proximity and fear, was Elijah Pierce. Watson's breath caught. Elijah looked smaller than before, his face drawn, eyes hollow with exhaustion. yet he was alive. And in that moment, Watson understood the true cruelty of their plan. Elijah's life was being used as a prop in the very theatre of light and darkness that had already killed one man. Holmes's posture changed slightly, a subtle shift that signaled readiness. Lestrade's eyes locked on the trio. Crowe guided Elijah forward toward the lantern, and Hargreaves followed as though he were simply witnessing justice unfold. Watson stepped forward, parcel visible now, bait offered. Crowe's gaze flicked to it, then to Watson, then to the lantern overhead. He smiled faintly, as if satisfied. "Dr. Watson," Crowe said softly, polite as ever, "how conscientious of you." Watson said nothing. He held the parcel as if it were heavy with consequences. Hargreaves's eyes shone with controlled anticipation. "Let us be swift," Hargreaves murmured. "The city is tired of waiting." Crowe lifted one hand slightly, an almost invisible gesture. And above them, the lantern's flame fluttered. Watson felt the hair rise on his arms. The halo trembled, thinned, then thickened again. A breath of wind, or something that wanted to feel like wind, passed through the fog. The lantern went out. Not with the lazy dying of a failing mantle, but with a suddenness that felt commanded, like a lid snapped shut. Darkness surged around them, thick and intimate. The street seemed to vanish beyond the immediate reach of their bodies. Watson heard a quick intake of breath from Elijah, heard Crowe shift, heard the soft sound of a step that did not belong to any planned position. Holmes moved in the dark. Watson sensed it more than saw it, the precise glide of a man who had been waiting for this moment to become proof. Then, as if a hand had released the valve again, the lantern flared back to life. Light returned in a harsh, eager burst, revealing faces frozen in instinct. Hargreaves blinked, startled by his own success. Crowe's expression tightened, and Elijah stared straight at Crowe, his mouth opening as though the truth had finally been forced to the surface by the very darkness meant to suppress it. Watson leaned forward, heart hammering, willing him to speak. Elijah's lips trembled. His eyes darted, briefly, to Hargreaves, then to the line of men in the fog, then to the watching street, as if seeing how many eyes were hungry for a villain. And then, with the lantern burning overhead like a witness of its own, Elijah lifted a shaking hand and pointed, past Crowe, past Hargreaves, toward the edge of the crowd. Toward the limping figure being pushed forward by constables. Toward Thomas Rook. And Elijah's voice, hoarse with fear and ownership, rang out into the fog as he began to accuse the wrong man. Elijah's finger was still raised, the accusation still forming on his tongue, when Holmes stepped into the thin circle of lantern light and made the moment stop, like a hand laid gently, decisively, over a flame before it could leap. "Before you condemn a man," Holmes said, voice calm enough to cut through the fog's hush, "you will listen to the words that have been put into your mouth." The street seemed to hold its breath. The lantern above them hissed faintly, as if irritated at being used so crudely. Around the circle of light, faces crowded in, ordinary men and women drawn by the promise of a spectacle, constables pretending to be part of the crowd pretending not to be afraid. Some had come for justice. Many had come for certainty. Thomas Rook stood a pace forward of the nearest constable, shoulders tight, one boot angled strangely, the limp that had been turned into a headline. He looked as men look when they realize their life has been reduced to a story told by strangers. His eyes held anger, yes, but also the bafflement of someone who cannot understand how he became the answer to a question he did not ask. Elijah Pierce's hand shook. The fog made his face look paler, his eyes darker. He stared at Rook, then flicked his gaze to Crowe, and in that flicker Watson saw the truth of it. Elijah's finger did not point where his heart believed. It pointed where fear directed. Crow, polished, composed, stood close enough to Elijah that the witness could feel the presence behind him, even without being touched. Hargreaves lingered a little to one side, his expression arranged into the careful gravity of a man who wished to appear reluctant, as though he were being forced into harsh necessity for the city's sake. Lestrade's jaw was clenched. Watson could see the inspector's mind dividing into two halves, the part that wanted an arrest to end the uproar, and the part that recognized, painfully, that the uproar itself had been manufactured. Holmes lifted his hand, palm outward, not to silence people by force, but to ask for the kind of attention that comes when a voice carries conviction without volume. "Mr. Pierce," Holmes said, "you were trained to say certain things. You were trained to describe a man you could not truly see. And you were trained, above all, to point at the convenient villain when the light returned." Elijah's lips parted, his eyes filled with something like plea. I saw," he began. Holmes interrupted gently, without cruelty. "You saw what they taught you to see," Holmes said, "and now I will show you how I know." From inside his coat, Holmes produced a folded sheet of paper, protected from damp by a thin wrap of oilskin. In the lantern light it looked plain, but the way Holmes held it, careful, almost reverent, made it feel heavier than any weapon. "This," Holmes said, "is your handwriting from years ago." Elijah froze, his breath caught hard enough that Watson heard it. Crow's expression did not change, but Watson saw the minute tightening in his jaw, the smallest flicker in his eyes that betrayed calculation shifting into alarm. Hargreaves's gaze sharpened, like a man suddenly realizing the stage might not behave as rehearsed. Holmes unfolded the paper slowly, letting the crowd glimpse lines of ink without understanding them. He did not offer it to the public, he offered it to the witness. "Elijah Pierce," Holmes said quietly, "look at it." Elijah's eyes darted to the page and recoiled, as if the ink itself were a blade. Holmes continued, voice still calm, still controlled. "Years ago there was a fire," Holmes said. "A woman injured, a convenient culprit needed, and you, an anxious young man, eager to be free of trouble, were persuaded to sign a statement that did not belong to your own mind. You were given phrases. You were given certainty. You were told it was for order, for peace, for the good of everyone." Elijah's throat worked. His hands trembled at his sides, empty now, the pointing finger fallen as if it had lost the strength to accuse. Holmes lifted the paper slightly. "This is the original," Holmes said. "And tonight your rehearsed words, the way you described what you saw, the way you arranged your sentences, even the way you inserted hesitation, match the pattern of fear in this ink." Lestrade stared, face hardening into attention. Watson saw his eyes flick toward Crow, connecting the calm gentleman to the old machinery of coercion. Holmes turned his head slightly, and his gaze met Crow's, brief, polite, devastating. "The same hand," Holmes said, "does not always write the words, but it often teaches the words." Crow's smile tried to appear. It did not fully arrive. "This is theatrical," Crow said smoothly. "Mr. Holmes delights in dramatics. The witness is under strain." Holmes did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Then let us do something that requires no drama at all," Holmes said. "Let us compare." He reached into his coat again and drew out Elijah's recent statement, the one Lestrade had taken, the one that had spread through the papers. Holmes held both sheets, side by side, like two mirrors angled toward each other. Watson watched the moment land, not on the crowd, but on Elijah. The witness stared at the papers, as if seeing his own imprisonment for the first time in visible form. Holmes spoke softly now, as if speaking to Elijah alone. "Do you see the phrases?" Holmes asked. Do you see how your fear writes itself the same way, the same little justifications, the same insistence upon clarity when your memory cannot support it, the same sentence structure, as though someone built you a narrow road and told you to walk it? Elijah's eyes brimmed, his shoulders shook. The fog seemed to press closer, hungry for confession and collapse. Holmes took one step nearer, careful not to crowd him. "Tell me," Holmes said, "what color was the flame when the lantern returned?" Elijah flinched at the question, remembering the trap in Baker Street, remembering how he had been corrected. He whispered, "I don't know." Crow's mouth opened, perhaps to offer the right answer, perhaps to rescue again. Holmes snapped his gaze toward him, and the room, the street, felt suddenly sharper. "Do not," Holmes said quietly. It was not a shout, it was worse than a shout. It was a command delivered with the authority of evidence. Crow closed his mouth. Hargreaves's eyes flicked to Crow, then to the crowd, calculating how quickly the story could be redirected. Holmes returned to Elijah. "You don't know," Holmes repeated, "because you didn't truly see, because you were placed beneath the lantern and told what to say once the darkness had done its work." Elijah's breath broke. "Yes," he whispered. The word was small, but it split the air. A murmur ran through the crowd, the sound of public certainty cracking. Someone muttered an oath. Someone else stepped back, as if afraid of being implicated by proximity. Thomas Rook's face tightened, a mixture of fury and relief so sharp it looked like pain. Lestrade moved forward, eyes on Elijah, voice low. "Pierce," Lestrade said, "if you've lied to me." Elijah shook his head violently, tears spilling. "I didn't want to," he said, voice rising with desperation. "I didn't want any of it. I was told where to stand. I was told the lantern would go out. I was told I'd hear a sound and then I'd see a man running. I was told to remember the limp because a limp is easy for people to believe. And I was told," he swallowed, his shame visible in the way his gaze dropped to the stones. "I was told if I didn't, the old paper would come back and ruin me." Watson felt a tightness in his chest, not only for the cruelty of it, but for the recognition of the mechanism. Fear as a leash, shame as a collar. Holmes did not speak over Elijah. He let the confession breathe. He let it be ugly, human, uneven. That was the point. Truth was never as tidy as the lie. Lestrade's eyes flicked to Crow again. "And who told you?" Lestrade demanded. Elijah's eyes went to Crow, helplessly, as if the habit of obedience still pulled him. Crow's expression remained composed, but the lantern light made his face look harder, less charming. Hargreaves shifted his weight slightly, a man preparing to glide away if the tide turned. Holmes spoke, still calm. "Edwin Crow," Holmes said, giving the name like a key turning in a lock. "Former solicitor's clerk, disgraced quietly after allegations of witness tampering. He returns with a new name and a larger stage." The name traveled through the crowd with confusion, but names did not need to be understood by everyone to matter. They needed only to land in the right ears. Lestrade's voice sharpened. "Crow," he said, "you're under arrest." Crow gave a faint smile, as if pitying Lestrade's simplicity. "For what?" Crow asked. "For being present on a street, for having concern for a relative." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "For controlling the light," Holmes said, "for engineering darkness as leverage, for turning testimony into currency." Hargreaves's tone entered smoothly, like oil poured on troubled water. "This is dangerous rhetoric," Hargreaves said. "You cannot accuse civic-minded men of conspiracy simply because a witness, under stress, wavers." Holmes looked at Hargreaves then, and Watson felt the temperature change again. Holmes's attention, once turned, made a man feel as though he had been weighed. "Civic-minded," Holmes repeated softly. "You used that same phrase in the back room of your club. You spoke of order and illumination as principles, and you spoke of fear as a market." Hargreaves's smile held, but the skin around it tightened. "You have no proof," Hargreaves said. Holmes gestured upward, to the lantern still burning. "The proof," Holmes said, "is above your head and beneath your feet." He turned slightly to Lestrade. "The gasworks," Holmes said, "a hidden switchboard, a diversion apparatus that can dim specific lines on demand. You may verify it tonight, Inspector, if you wish to see your city's darkness in the form of valves and chalk marks." Lestrade hesitated, only a moment, then nodded once, grim, like a man swallowing something bitter and necessary. His hand lifted, signaling to his men. The constables moved with new purpose, not toward the ex-soldier, but toward Crow and Hargreaves. Crow's composure held a fraction longer than Hargreaves's. Then Crow's eyes flicked, quick and sharp, toward a side alley, an escape route. Holmes did not step forward with drama. He simply spoke again to Elijah, and the words landed like a final cut. "Elijah," Holmes said, "tell them what you were taught to say." Elijah's shoulders shook. He looked at the crowd, at Thomas Rook, at Lestrade, and then finally he looked at Watson. Watson did not speak. He did not need to. He let Elijah see in his face the simple fact that redemption was not a clean door you walked through. It was a hard sentence spoken at the cost of everything. Elijah swallowed and began. He described how Crow had taken him aside days earlier, how he had been walked through the lane in daylight and shown where to stand. He described the exact phrases he had been told to use, how to mention the limp, how to speak of a cap, how to offer certainty like a gift. He described being corrected like a lantern corrected, trimmed, adjusted, made to burn a certain way. "They taught me," Elijah said, voice breaking, "to see with their eyes. They taught me what fear looks like, and then they put fear into me and said it was proof." The crowd's murmur rose again, but changed. Less hunger now, more unease. The kind of unease that comes when people realize they have been invited to be part of something ugly. Thomas Rook's breath came out in a harsh sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Lestrade's face was pale, not with cowardice, but with the strain of recognizing that his job, his beloved simplicity of arrests and evidence, had been turned into theater. He stepped toward Rook and spoke briefly, low enough that only those nearest heard. "You're not under arrest," Lestrade said. "Not now, not on this." Rook's eyes flashed. "You nearly had me hanged on it," he spat. Lestrade did not argue. He only nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a truth that will haunt him. Hargreaves tried once more, voice smooth, to regain the narrative. "This is an overreach," he said, "a misguided spectacle. London needs stability, not..." Holmes's gaze met his. "London needs truth," Holmes said. "Stability purchased with counterfeit testimony is merely quiet before the next manufactured scream." In the end, it was not a grand collapse that ended them. It was the simple movement of law finally turning in the right direction. Constables closed around Crow, around Hargreaves, around men who had assumed their respectability made them untouchable. Crow's eyes held Elijah's for a brief moment, an old ownership attempting to reassert itself with a look. Elijah flinched, then barely, but unmistakably, straightened. The smallest flame, Watson thought, can be kept steady if you shield it with your hands. Later, away from the crowd, in a quieter room where the air did not taste of fog and public appetite, Elijah broke fully. Not theatrically, simply like a man who has held his shame for too long and can no longer carry it. He sat with his head in his hands, voice raw, and confessed not only what he had been told to say, but why he had said it. He confessed the old statement, the years of being owned by ink, the quiet terror of knowing that one's signature could erase a life. He spoke of how Crow had approached him with gentleness like a trap, offering family where there was only leverage. Holmes did not lecture, he listened. When he spoke, it was only to place truth where it belonged. Truth, Holmes said quietly, is not merely found. It must be protected, because there are men who study how to counterfeit it. If you're still with me, you'll want to hear what comes next in stories like these, because the most dangerous crimes are often the ones that look, at first glance, entirely ordinary. And if these cases grip you, staying subscribed helps you catch the next one when it arrives. By the time they returned to Baker Street, the fog had thinned, and the street lanterns along the road glowed in a patient line, each flame steady in its glass casing. The city looked calmer, as though it had been soothed by the simple fact that an arrest had happened, though Watson knew the deeper calm would take longer. People do not like to admit how easily they can be steered. Holmes paused beneath their own lamp outside 221B and looked down the street, his face half-lit, half-shadowed. "London fears darkness," he murmured, more to the lantern than to Watson, "but it should fear the hands that decide when the light goes out."